15 American military jets. Gone. Forced out. Not by an enemy, but by a NATO ally, a democratic partner of the United States, in a stunning act of defiance that has shaken the foundations of the Atlantic Alliance. Spain, a country that hosts some of the most strategically vital American air bases in the entire Western world, looked Washington in the eye and said, "No, you cannot use our land to wage your war on Iran." And then the planes left. And then Donald Trump went ballistic. And then the world held its breath. Because what just happened between Spain and the United States could change the shape of NATO, the outcome of the Iran war, and the future of global diplomacy forever. Welcome to The Full Story. Stay right here. There are moments in modern geopolitics that seem almost impossible to imagine until they actually happen. Moments so dramatic, so loaded with tension, so rich in consequence, that seasoned foreign policy analysts are left scrambling to find historical parallels. What unfolded between the United States and Spain in the first week of March 2026 is exactly one of those moments. It is a story about war and sovereignty, about alliances under pressure, about one man's moral conviction versus another man's fury, and about 15 military aircraft that silently slipped out of southern Spain and into the pages of history. Let us begin at the beginning, because context in this story is everything. On the morning of Saturday, February 28th, 2026, the world woke up to the thunder of what the United States military would call Operation Epic Fury. In the pre-dawn hours, American and Israeli forces launched coordinated, large-scale strikes against the Islamic Republic of Iran. The targets were multiple and deliberate. Iran's nuclear infrastructure, its ballistic missile bases, its senior military leadership, and the innermost circle of the regime's command. According to reporting from Reuters, the Associated Press, CNBC, and multiple verified intelligence analysts, the strikes were the culmination of months of collapsed diplomacy. Negotiations mediated through Oman and conducted in Geneva, quiet, tense sessions involving Iranian, American, and Israeli envoys, had ultimately broken down over Iran's refusal to make concessions on its ballistic missile program, which Washington had declared a non-negotiable red line. The United States had wanted complete restrictions on enrichment and full inspection access. Iran had offered partial accommodations. The gap could not be bridged, and so the bombs fell. The consequences were staggering. According to White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, confirmed by U.S. officials and widely reported by major news outlets, including the Daily Caller, Fox News, and Al Jazeera, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was killed in the strikes. He was not alone. A total of 48 other senior Iranian leaders perished alongside him: commanders, military officials, regime architects. The decapitation of Iran's leadership structure was, by any measure, unprecedented in modern warfare. At the same time, Iranian government sources claimed that the strikes had also killed hundreds of civilians, including children, after a missile reportedly struck a school in the south of the country. These claims could not be independently verified in the immediate hours following the attack, but they were picked up by international media and immediately ignited a firestorm of moral debate across the globe. And then Iran fought back. The retaliation, when it came, was ferocious and widespread. Iranian forces launched strikes across the Middle East, targeting American bases and American allies with a fury that reflected both military capability and deep political desperation. Striking social media footage, verified by multiple sources and reported by the Olive Press, showed bombed-out hotels and commercial buildings in Dubai, flames rising from the skyline of Tel Aviv, and thick plumes of black smoke billowing from American military installations in Qatar and Bahrain. Iran struck a Saudi Aramco oil facility, a move with enormous economic implications, given how tightly global oil markets had already been coiled with anxiety. Iran also hit an Amazon data center in the United Arab Emirates, a target whose destruction sent shockwaves not just through the regional economy, but through the global technology sector. Multiple United States jets were reported crashed, the exact number subject to ongoing military reporting. And in a particularly alarming development, unmanned Iranian drones struck the RAF base at Akrotiri in Cyprus, prompting British Prime Minister Keir Starmer to immediately authorize the evacuation of military families stationed on the island. In Kuwait, 6 United States service members were killed when Iranian forces struck a base housing American troops. As of Monday, March 2, 2026, 6 U.S. military deaths had been confirmed, with casualty numbers potentially rising. The world, quite literally, was on fire. And into this inferno walked Pedro Sánchez. The Spanish Prime Minister was in Barcelona on Sunday, March 1st, attending the annual Mobile World Congress, one of the world's most prestigious technology conferences. Standing before a global audience, Sánchez chose that moment to deliver what would become one of the most consequential political speeches by a European leader in recent memory. He did not mince words. He condemned the American and Israeli strikes on Iran without reservation, calling the military action unilateral, describing it as a breach of international law, and characterizing it as an unjustified, dangerous military intervention that is outside the realm of international law. He acknowledged, clearly and specifically, that one can oppose the Iranian regime, a regime which he himself called hateful, and, simultaneously, oppose a war waged without authorization from the United States Congress or the United Nations Security Council. His statement was not ambiguous. It was not diplomatic hedging. It was a direct, full-throated, moral and legal condemnation of a war being waged by his country's most powerful ally. It is possible to be against a hateful regime, Sánchez said, according to reporting by Reuters and Al Jazeera, and at the same time be against an unjustified, dangerous military intervention that is outside international law. One must be against a war that was started without the authorization of the U.S. Congress or the UN Security Council, and as I said before, violates international law. He closed by calling for an immediate de-escalation, demanding respect for international law, and emphasizing that Spain would always be on the side of dialogue, not destruction. He added that Spain aimed for democracy, freedom, and fundamental rights for the Iranian people, but would not be drawn into a war it had not authorized and did not support. Now, political speeches are one thing. Policy action is another. Spain had said its piece. What would it actually do? The answer came on Monday, March 2nd, 2026, and it arrived with the force of a geopolitical earthquake. Spanish Foreign Minister José Manuel Albares appeared on the Spanish public broadcaster Telecinco and delivered a statement that would ricochet around the world within hours. In clear, unambiguous language, Albares declared that Spain would not allow its military bases to be used for attacks on Iran. Spanish bases are not being used for this operation, he said, and they will not be used for anything not included in the agreement with the United States or for anything that is not in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. He reaffirmed Spain's sovereignty over the bases. Although Naval Station Rota and Morón Air Base in southern Andalusia are jointly operated by Spanish and American forces, they remain under Spanish sovereign authority. Spanish law governs what they can and cannot be used for, and under that law, under that sovereignty, Spain was saying no. The bases themselves are not minor installations. They are strategically vital pieces of the American military infrastructure in the Western Mediterranean. Naval Station Rota, situated on the Bay of Cadiz between the towns of Rota and El Puerto de Santa Maria in Andalusia's Cadiz province, is a crucial hub for the United States Navy in southern Europe. Morón Air Base, located approximately 56 kilometers southeast of Seville, serves as a key staging ground for American air power throughout the region. These are not symbolic facilities. They are the kind of real-world military assets that shape military strategy, extend operational range, and provide the logistical backbone for long-reach missions. And the aircraft that had been stationed there, primarily Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker aerial refueling jets, are precisely the kind of assets you need when you are running air operations deep into Iranian territory, thousands of miles from the American homeland. What happened next was captured in extraordinary real-time detail by flight tracking website Flight Radar 24. And the data told a story that no press release could have fully conveyed. 15 United States military aircraft departed Spain's Rota and Morón bases in rapid succession. On the morning of Sunday, March 1st, 2026, 9 aerial refueling tankers lifted off from Morón Air Base and headed northeast toward Germany. 7 of those aircraft, according to Flight Radar 24's tracking maps, widely cited by Reuters, Al Monitor, and Spain in English, landed at Ramstein Air Base, America's enormous military hub in southwestern Germany and the logistical nerve center of the United States European Command. 2 additional flights departed from Rota, heading towards southern France. 4 more flights took off from Rota, with their final destinations not registered in the public tracking system. In total, 15 American military aircraft that had been permanently stationed in Spain, as Defense Minister Margarita Robles confirmed, had left Spanish territory. The movement was not subtle. It was visible to anyone with a smartphone and an internet browser. Flight tracking enthusiasts, journalists, and intelligence analysts around the world watched in something approaching disbelief as America's military assets quietly and efficiently repositioned themselves out of the country that had just refused to host them. Defense Minister Robles was careful to note that the departing aircraft were not a temporary strike package being pulled back. They were permanently based assets. This was not a temporary tactical repositioning. It was a fundamental shift, a physical expression of a political rupture. Spain was now an outlier, and a very conspicuous one. The contrast with other major European nations was striking. Britain's initial response to the Iran conflict had, in fact, mirrored Spain's. Prime Minister Keir Starmer had initially refused to authorize the use of British military bases for attacks on Iran. For a brief window, London and Madrid seemed aligned. But that alignment shattered on Sunday when Starmer reversed course, authorizing British bases for what he described as collective self-defense in response to Iran's widening retaliatory strikes. The RAF base at Akrotiri in Cyprus had already been hit by Iranian drones. British families of military personnel had already been evacuated. Faced with that reality, Starmer concluded that Britain had no choice but to support its NATO partners. France and Germany, meanwhile, signaled that they were open to enabling necessary and proportionate defensive action against Iran, according to Al Jazeera's reporting. Lithuania's presidential advisor went further still, declaring that his country would join Operation Epic Fury directly if asked by the Trump administration. Spain stood alone. The only European Union head of government to have openly condemned the American-Israeli strikes on Iran. The only NATO member to have physically removed American military assets from its territory rather than accommodating them. The only allied nation that had drawn a clear legal and moral line and held it. That line was about to be tested very severely. On Tuesday, March 3rd, 2026, Donald Trump sat in the Oval Office for a meeting with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. The cameras were rolling. The reporters were there. And Trump, who rarely lets an enemy go unanswered or a grudge go unexpressed, had clearly been stewing since Spain's refusal became public knowledge. When the conversation turned to European allies, Trump did not hold back. He called Spain terrible. He called it unfriendly. He turned to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, seated beside him, and said he had told him to cut off all dealings with Spain. Then, looking directly into the cameras, he made it official. We're going to cut off all trade with Spain. We don't want anything to do with Spain. The words landed like a bomb. The United States and Spain maintain a bilateral trade relationship worth approximately $47 billion annually in goods exchange, according to U.S. Census Bureau data cited by Fox Business, with the United States actually running a trade surplus of roughly $4.8 billion. A complete trade embargo would damage both economies, but would disproportionately harm Spain, given its export dependency on the American market. Spanish wine, olive oil, machinery, chemicals, and a host of other goods flow into the United States every year. Losing that market, even partially, would be a serious economic blow. But Trump went further. He claimed at the same Oval Office meeting that the United States could simply fly in and use Spanish bases, regardless of Madrid's permission, that nobody's going to tell us not to use it. He added, however, that his administration had chosen not to pursue that option. The implication was chilling. A threat, barely veiled, that American military force is not ultimately constrained by the sovereign decisions of its allies. This was not a message delivered in private diplomatic channels. It was delivered in front of cameras to the world. Bessent, for his part, confirmed that he believed the president had the authority to impose an embargo, citing a recent Supreme Court ruling that Trump maintained had reaffirmed his power to restrict commerce with foreign nations. Bessent said the U.S. Trade Representative and the Commerce Department would, quote, begin investigations and move forward, unquote, with the process. The Washington machinery of economic punishment was beginning to turn. Trump also piled on a second grievance: NATO defense spending. Spain, Trump said, was the only country in NATO that would not agree to go up to 5% of GDP in defense spending, the ambitious new target Trump had been pushing since the beginning of his second term. Spain had offered to reach approximately 2.1%, which it argued was sufficient to meet its military commitments through existing capability investments. Trump had already responded to that position with tariff threats. Now, the Iran dispute had merged with the NATO spending dispute to create a perfect storm of American rage directed at Madrid. Spain's response was immediate, and it was defiant. Madrid did not flinch. The Spanish government issued a statement confirming that it had, quote, the necessary resources to contain the possible impact of a trade embargo by the U.S. That was a deliberate message, measured, calm, and designed to project confidence. Sanchez's government was not going to be intimidated. Spanish Foreign Minister Albares had already, in response to Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz accusing Spain of, quote, siding with tyrants over its stance on Iran, delivered a reply that was simultaneously sharp and dignified. That's absurd and ridiculous, Albares said on Euronews. Spain has a coherent foreign policy. He elaborated. Spain has a coherent foreign policy, and we are always with democracy, and we are doing that consistently everywhere, in Gaza, in the Middle East, in Venezuela, in Greenland, in Ukraine. Very few countries in the world can say that. Spain's King Felipe VI also weighed in, issuing a solemn warning about the, quote, obvious risk of regional escalation and the, quote, unpredictable consequences of the conflict. The king called for, quote, the utmost restraint in the use of force, respect for the lives of civilians, and the pursuit of a diplomatic solution to the current logic of confrontation. For a constitutional monarch typically constrained by protocol from overt political commentary, the statement was unusually direct, a reflection of how grave the moment felt in Madrid. Inside Spain, the political response was deeply divided along partisan lines. Conservative opposition leader Alberto Núñez Feijóo attacked Sánchez with extraordinary sharpness, warning, something is wrong when Hamas, the Houthis, and the Iranian regime applaud this government. That is not defending Spain's interests, but putting them at risk. He framed the choice in stark terms, with freedom or with tyrants. Sánchez, predictably, rejected the framing entirely. He argued that opposing an illegal war was not the same as siding with the enemy. He maintained that Spain's position was constitutionally grounded, legally coherent, and diplomatically principled. He was not defending Iran. He was defending international law. The American military community was watching all of this with its own kind of interest. Defense Minister Margarita Robles confirmed that the departing KC-135 Stratotankers were not visiting aircraft. They were permanently stationed. Their departure was therefore more than a logistical inconvenience. It represented the physical dismantling of a piece of American military posture in southern Europe that had been in place for decades. The 1953 Pact of Madrid, formalized in various subsequent agreements, had given the United States its foothold in Spain as part of Cold War strategy. Now, 70-plus years later, that arrangement was under serious strain. Strategically, the relocation of those 9 tankers to Ramstein Air Base in Germany altered the calculus of American operational reach into the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Aerial refueling tankers are force multipliers. They extend the combat range of fighter jets, bombers, and surveillance aircraft. Without them based in southern Spain, the radius of American air power centered on the western Mediterranean is fundamentally changed. Whether the United States views this as a temporary disruption or a permanent strategic realignment will depend significantly on how the broader political crisis resolves. But make no mistake, the physical departure of those aircraft was not merely symbolic. It had real operational implications for an ongoing war. Zoom out even further, and the picture becomes more philosophically complex. What Spain did, what Pedro Sánchez chose to do, represents something genuinely unusual in modern alliance politics. It is one thing for a NATO member to abstain from a military operation. It is another thing entirely to physically block that operation by removing the infrastructure needed to conduct it. France famously refused to participate in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the transatlantic relationship survived. Turkey periodically asserts its sovereign prerogatives in ways that irritate Washington, and NATO has managed. But the combination of Spain's public moral condemnation, its formal denial of base access, the actual departure of American aircraft, and then the American president's public threat to devastate Spain's economy, all within the space of a single week, represents a qualitative escalation in intra-alliance tension that has few modern precedents. Sanchez's defenders would point to international law, to the UN Charter, to the absence of congressional authorization for the Iran strikes, to the unilateral nature of what President Trump and the Israeli government did on the morning of February 28th. They would argue that a healthy alliance, a genuine alliance of democratic nations, not merely a military arrangement of convenience, must allow member states to exercise sovereign moral judgment. They would say that an ally willing to hold Washington accountable is ultimately more valuable than one that simply nods along. Trump's defenders would point to strategic reality, to the existential threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon, to the chaos and carnage of Iran's retaliatory strikes, and to the argument that decisive action now prevents a far worse war later. They would say that in moments of genuine military crisis, allies who withdraw support are not neutral. They are, in effect, making a choice. And they would say that the economic consequences Trump threatened are a legitimate tool of pressure within the American president's legal and constitutional authority, particularly following the Supreme Court ruling that Bessent referenced. Both arguments contain truth. And both, depending on which television channel you watch, which newspaper you read, which country you live in, will feel more or less persuasive. That ambiguity, that genuine moral complexity, is part of what makes this story so remarkable. This is not a simple tale of right and wrong. It is a story about what happens when democratic allies disagree in real time about a real war, and neither side is entirely wrong. What happens next will define much of the geopolitical landscape for years to come. Will the United States actually impose a trade embargo on Spain? Bessent signaled that investigations would begin, but Trump has wielded economic threats before against Canada, Mexico, and the European Union at various points, and not always followed through. Spain has suggested it has the economic resilience to weather the storm. The European Union, meanwhile, will be watching closely. A U.S. trade embargo on an EU member state would trigger a collective EU response, and Brussels has, in recent years, grown considerably more assertive in standing up to American economic pressure. Will the 15 departed American aircraft return to Spain? That depends entirely on whether the political dispute gets resolved, and resolution looks distant right now. Ramstein Air Base can accommodate them indefinitely, but the strategic implications of that shift will be felt in NATO planning rooms for months to come. Will Spain's position soften as Iran's retaliatory strikes continue and the human cost of the conflict mounts? Or will it harden, particularly if civilian casualty reports from Iran, the bombed schools, the dead children, continue to emerge and receive international attention? Sanchez appears personally committed. He staked major political capital on this stance. Backing down now would be domestically devastating for him, even as the right wing hammers him for what they describe as alignment with tyrants. And what of Iran itself? With Khamenei dead, with 48 of the regime's senior figures killed, with nuclear infrastructure degraded, what comes next? Trump himself told reporters he had not entirely closed the door on diplomacy, with reports describing post-strike outreach from transitional Iranian figures. But Iran's retaliatory attacks on Gulf infrastructure, on American bases, on allied facilities across the region, these do not suggest a regime ready to negotiate from a position of defeat. They suggest a regime willing to go down swinging. The Iran War, Operation Epic Fury, is ongoing. The diplomatic war between Washington and Madrid is ongoing. The alliance crisis within NATO is ongoing. And in the middle of it all, 15 Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker aircraft are parked at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, having departed the sun-drenched Andalusian plains of southern Spain, a vivid, practical, undeniable symbol of a moment when a longtime ally looked at the most powerful nation on Earth and said, enough. This is the world we are now living in, a world where even the bedrock arrangements of the post-World War II international order, the Atlantic Alliance, the NATO commitment, the shared democratic values that were supposed to bind the West together, are being tested in real time by a war in the Middle East, by a president who plays geopolitical hardball with friend and foe alike, and by a Spanish prime minister who appears genuinely willing to bet his political career on the proposition that sovereignty and international law mean something, even when America disagrees. Whether history will vindicate Pedro Sánchez or Donald Trump, or neither, is a question that cannot yet be answered. What can be said, with confidence, with certainty, and with the full weight of the evidence before us, is that what happened in the skies above southern Spain on the morning of March 1st, 2026, when 15 American military jets climbed away from their bases and turned toward Germany, was not a small thing. It was not a footnote. It was a signal, loud, clear, and unmistakable, that the world is changing. This story, this crisis, is just beginning, and we will be here every step of the way to bring it to you. Verified, sourced, and told in full. This has been your complete news report on the Spain-Iran-U.S. base crisis of March 2026, brought to you by all available confirmed and verified sources, including Reuters, Al Jazeera, Bloomberg, the Associated Press, Fox Business, OPB, Al Monitor, the Olive Press, Spain in English, AeroTime, the Flight Radar 24 tracking platform, Common Dreams, and direct statements from Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez, Spanish Foreign Minister José Manuel Albares, Spanish Defense Minister Margarita Robles, U.S. President Donald Trump, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and Spanish King Felipe VI. Stay informed, stay critical, and we will see you in the next one.